All right, so today I'm going to talk about this booklet, Are Humans More Than a Body? And I'm going to say this is by Travis Pelletier. I don't know if that's how you say his name. I haven't met Travis, so Travis, apologies if you see this recording later, but I love the booklet very much. Certainly interested in this topic because of several reasons. One is I think it's speaking to this generation. It's really speaking to some trends that we see now in the 21st century about identity, who you are as a person. And I could see this even expanding into other booklets along those lines as we go forward in the future. It's a very readable book. And at the very end, and I'll just skip to what's at the very end in the book, they give a list of references that are at different reading levels. So I would rank this book to be more of somewhere between high school and early college in terms of the writing. I mean, I think the reading comprehension level is probably high school at that level. The ideas themselves are, I would say, graduate school ideas, but they don't try to cloak it with a lot of technical language. And I think you'll find that a tricky balancing act. So the challenge here for an author is to keep true to the ideas without using a lot of complicated terms or without going into details. So in terms of expectations, reading this book, I think, again, it does a good job in the arguments that it makes. But then also there's a lot of room for people to do some further study if they have some more detailed questions. So let's get into it here. This is the outline of the book. First, it talks about reductive physicalism, then dualism, and gives 10 evidences for the soul. Then talks about non-reductive physicalism, 7 objections from physicalism. And then there's a conclusion affirming the biblical claims. All right, so here's the definition of reductive physicalism. Humans are just physical bodies. And it has a list there of people who have written along those lines. Now, it's not saying that all these authors have identical definitions of reductive physicalism, but essentially they belong in this group because they are making the same claim about humans just being physical bodies. Second idea here is about dualism. Human persons are the body, physical stuff, and soul, which is purely mental. And the proponents there are some people who are alive, like J.P. Moreland, and also some very well-known authors from history. And I know, so I put Aquinas, I forgot his comma, but it's not one person. It's Aquinas and Descartes are two different people. All right, so let's go. The way the book goes, instead of talking about the negative arguments in detail, first it starts with establishing the 10 evidences for the soul. And the reason it uses this word evidence, it's not saying it's provable in the deductive sense. It's more of an abductive proof. It's inclinations from daily life that this is true. And I would add, I think if this were part of a group discussion and it were being used in a chapter, it would be good to challenge the students to come up with additional examples for each category, which might not even be stated, because in the book, it really just goes over maybe 1 or 2 examples and just a couple of paragraphs, but they try to illustrate the main ideas. First idea here is the unity of consciousness. So the question is, and I have a person here who is on a floating, and I don't know if that's a kayak or some sort of sea thing, but a yoga pose there on the water. The idea here is, even though the human body has all these millions of cells, and then we have all these atoms that are even smaller than cells, there's still this idea of unity of consciousness, that we tell a story. And it's not just Christians that say this, it's also a widely known secular phenomenon, people telling stories or the stories that they write and the fictions that we write. So here's the argument. The argument says that this data only makes sense if a person has a soul, which unifies the experiences in all the senses on their body. And anyone knows from being an athlete, there's a certain consciousness, and I think for people who practice yoga or many type of sports, There's a certain body awareness that one gets when you're practicing a sport, that at the same time you're aware of the different parts and senses that are on your body, everything from temperature to how it feels in your muscles. And yet there's a conscious story that if you're telling the story about you being on this raft floating on a lake, at some other time, it's a unified experience. And that's the first evidence here. The second evidence here is identity over time. And then we have a picture of two people here. And the question is that, what accounts for our identity over time? What accounts for the fact that we can remember things from our early self and that we carry forth something called a personality? And it's even recognized by secular people, I think, at some point about our psyche and our psychology of our being. And the argument for a soul is that if we each have this immaterial soul, then we have something that unifies experience of the world over time. So the first one had to do with a point in time, and this one has to do with over time. So over time, even though our cells are being changed, and we lose cells over time, and our cells change, and you see the young man here with hair, and then as you get older, maybe your hair grays or gets white. But even though your body changes, there's a still idea that you still have that same identity. And again, I go to secular world, I push the argument because we all have this idea of people having an identity. We issue ID cards, we issue passports. There is something in the secular world that gives a nod toward this idea of a soul. The third idea here is mental causation. And here I have a tennis player. And again, the person has to have a conscious idea of hitting this ball with a tennis racket. And this example was not in the book, but this slide came up, as far as an illustration. So if physicalism were true, the informational content of our thoughts wouldn't matter. But the mental causation, the idea here is that we can have an effect on the world around us. And so there is this idea of cause and effect. And it's not just all sports. And so for people who watch sports shows or talk about athletes and teams, what was their plan? What was the plan of the coach? What was the plan of the team? This isn't in terms of sports, but we see it in business also, with businesses executing strategies. So this idea of being able to use your mind and create a cause, this is strong evidence, again, of that unity. There's a unity in something that doesn't come from the individual parts of the body. And even if you consider the brain alone, because look at this here, the brain alone is not going to hit that tennis ball. Yes, the brain's activated, and I'm going over the rough argument. I know someone who's a brain scientist will have an even deeper explanation, but it's not just the brain. You have to activate the entire body and train that to be able to hit that ball. Third one here, the idea is free will, rationality, and moral responsibility. Where do we see that in the real world? All right, so this is a picture of a coffee bar where you have to go and make an order. So the fact that somebody has an ability to make a choice, and not just a choice for one part of your body, but to make a choice for your whole body. So your stomach sends a signal and says, you know what, I want to eat something here. We have some food here on the right of the picture, and then maybe I want to order a drink. And this whole idea of rationality and moral responsibility, it's even well known in the secular world. We have laws that are built around this idea of free will, rationality, moral responsibility. The fact that we use this word responsibility as assigned to a specific person indicates that we have a soul. All right, here's a good question. And sometimes someone will have this question asked by a doctor or a close friend. You have an event happens, and I'll ask you, how does it feel? How does it feel? How does it feel? How do you summarize? And and I think we've all seen these stories where we try to explain a feeling, and words can begin to express that. And we've seen words express feelings in terms of songs, in terms of poetry, in terms of well-written literature. So we know in those formats that it is possible for language to represent feelings. And yet sometimes there's also more than just what we're able to express. And still, when someone goes through an experience and asks you the question, as we were talking earlier, did you have a good day? That is something that still someone can summarize, and you don't even have to be an expert on this. You could still ask children the same thing. How does it feel? How did it feel when you went to school? So the idea here, whether it's pleasure, whether it's pain, that indicates that we have a soul. And then there's this idea of knowledge. And knowledge means the facts of something don't tell the entire story. You still have to live through it. And I have a picture here of somebody who is in a sling because it reminds me of the time when I broke my arm and I knew what injuries were like. I've seen all types of people and injured so many types of things. But the assertion here is that you don't know what something's like until you experience it. So that experience itself indicates that that impression is on your soul. And that's the same idea of going on a new vacation or visiting a new place. These are examples of indicating that the soul is real. Another idea here is about private access. And we're in an interesting age now with technology where we have all these ability to do biometrics. I have a watch that does my pulse rate. I have an oximeter that I can wear and it tells me what my oxygen level is in the body. But when it comes to your thoughts, when it comes to your feelings, your emotions, it's still something that people have to ask. And it's still something that, you know, it's not completely open to outside observation. So that in itself indicates that just observing the cells of the body, you know, if we were to do it with computer resonance imaging or x-rays, doesn't tell the entire story. And that itself is evidence of a soul. And next one here is about intentionality. Here we have someone planning something on the table. Anytime we're planning something, we're thinking about a reality that's not true. And this is a big challenge too for artificial intelligence because it's often fed only with data that it's already seen. Here, it's not just reassembling information, which might be what we're doing when we're planning something in the future. It might be creating something entirely new, never seen before, a song that's never been sung, a tune that's never been written, a book that's never been expressed in that way. So the fact that we can have intentionality as individuals or groups indicates we have a soul. Next idea here is about modality. And modality has to do with how do we consider our body? Is our body all that exists? And it's what happens to us the same as what happens to our body. Is that one and the same thing? It's almost similar to the private access question. So let's say we had a firefighter here and he died. And for a moment, you know, we could imagine perhaps he could have an out-of-body experience where he wasn't there. But I thought of another one. What happens when we're sleeping? And we can still carry that experience back to the moment of the present. There's something there that's real that we can carry back as an experience that's different from what our atoms are telling us. And again, this is another evidence of a soul. And then this last idea here about near-death experiences. So just asking people, they quoted a Gallup poll 1992 in the United States, confirmed about 5% of Americans claim to have a near-death experience where they were not connected to their body. So that's just taking direct evidence from what people are saying. And the question is, if you can have an experience that's separate from your body, then that also is evidence of the soul. Not one of these things, you know, makes an entire case for a soul, but all 10 together indicate that it is reasonable to conclude that we have a soul. This idea here of non-reductive physicalism. So there's another idea that humans are physical, but may have non-physical properties. So this is a kind of a response to the secular person still trying to retain this idea of physicalism. So, and you know, when you look at it on the surface, first of all, it's self-refuting because how can you say it's physical, but it's also non-physical? So it's almost an argument from absurdism, you know, to make that type of statement that, yeah, we're physical, but we have these non-physical properties. Well, why not just buy into the simpler explanation that, of dualism. And that's the challenge. Now, there's several objections that are in the book. I'm not going to go through them, but I invite you to go through them on your own, and hopefully my presentation will interest you in reading more. The book ends with this conclusion, and it starts going into some scriptures. So again, one thing I want to say as far as the way the booklet it reads, it's not using scripture to build the philosophical arguments. Rather, it's using philosophical arguments to make a case for the soul. And then only in the conclusion, then it goes to the Bible. And these are two of the scriptures that are mentioned there to verify that the ideas that we find in the Bible have a concurrence with the philosophical arguments which were made earlier there. So it's here it says, oh, I'm sorry, I flipped the screen by touching my mouse. The Bible agrees with dualism and clearly teaches humans are both physical and spiritual. And these are two scriptures here in Genesis here and also in Zechariah. And then the end comes to a call to evangelism. So again, it gives enough Bible to let you know that there's a serious concern for what the Bible says on this topic, but it's built from a philosophical foundation. So anyway, that's the summary I have. I think that's a great little booklet and would be great to show for your chapter and have some interactive conversations. Does anyone have any comments or ideas?
Well, I thought it was an excellent presentation. I really liked your PowerPoint. You really talk about reductionism. You reduce the topic and the material into a very easy to understand and appealing presentation. So thank you very much. I just, I picked up on a couple of these points, and the how does one feel, and the free will and the intentionality. That also points to me to the existence of an abstract world, which is sort of along the same lines, because we know that the soul isn't physical, but it also shows me that there is an abstract world that just can't be explained by physicalism.
Agreed.
One of the things the other night, and I agree with everything Ross just said, and I appreciate the presentation too, Mark. One of the things that they mentioned, you said at the beginning about the philosophical approach, and students were saying, well, this is philosophy, but that list of the people who fall into this kind of camp in different ways at the beginning had Freud in there, and one of the students was a psychology major, and they were talking about studying psyche, the soul, psychology, and yet it's very biochemical oriented. It can all be explained by physics and by chemistry. And she wasn't finding it very satisfying that the human volitional dignity aspects weren't coming out. And then some of the others in terms of relative to critical theory and critical race theory, Marx was on the list, some others related to educational philosophy. So it is, this physicalism isn't just philosophy. It's kind of like naturalism in the university. It's pretty dominant as far as relevant conversations for just about anybody in any academic major in a public university. The near-death experience, when first mentioned, brought up some chuckles, but when they mentioned in the booklet about millions of cases worldwide was brought up, it's kind of seriously. Not that experience, defines reality, but the validity of the seriousness with which near-death experience is taken was talked about a little bit more, and Gary Habermas, somebody had done some reading and mentioned. So anyway, it's a fascinating conversation. Somebody else brought up the idea of, well, this is a body, soul. What about body, soul, spirit? You get that whole thing about regeneration by the Holy Spirit, what happens. But it was an interesting discussion, even evangelistically, when it turned that corner. After I skimmed the book, I woke up the morning before the first first the discussion with this verse on my mind. It wasn't in the verses on the list. Jesus saying, "Fear not those that are able to destroy the body, but fear the one who is able to destroy both the body and the soul in hell." So at least you get a testimony from Jesus that there is something valuable that should be guarded. Anyway.
But just real quick, dovetailing on what Joe just said on near-death experiences, I've spoken with a number of people who have had dying relatives, and it seems that there normally is a time of quickening where they'll just come out of whatever they're doing. I mean, whatever state they're in, like say a coma. Then they have lucidity for a very short time, and they communicate. And some of them, many of them actually are talking to people over on the other side. My beloved aunt, and oh, Thelma, there you are. Oh, you look so beautiful. Oh, you're so radiant. I'm coming. Things like this. So what explains that as well?
Right. Even the way they tell it, the unity of experience theme again, it's so much part of daily life. And from the time you're a small child and you can identify with a cartoon character that has a personality and an identity, and you take a lot of these things for granted and don't realize that they are actually evidences against this naturalistic worldview.
Hard to live consistent with it. Well nigh unto impossible. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.